Okay, so let me now introduce Dr. Biglieri. So Dr. Samantha Biglieri is an assistant professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning at the soon-to-be renamed Ryerson University. She is also a practicing urban planner and past president of the Toronto Council on Aging. Dr. Biglieri's work is at the intersection of health, planning, and encompasses three main areas: aging in the built environment, policy and housing, and understanding the lived experiences of people living with dementia in their neighborhoods, and the governance of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some examples of her research include investigating demographic change and age-friendly policy, testing e-bikes as alternative mobility tools for suburban older adults, and comparing the COVID-19 pandemic responses in Toronto and Milan. Dr. Biglieri's research has been featured in academic and industry publications, international conferences, the Canadian Library of Parliament, books, podcasts, and on CBC Radio. She is co-editor of Aging People, Aging Places from Policy Press, which was just released last year. That book is a combination of original academic research, practitioner and community member vignettes from urban, suburban, rural, and Indigenous perspectives, capturing experiences from across Canada. She also co-edited a special issue of Plan Canada on aging in summer 2021. Dr. Biglieri holds a PhD in planning from the University of Waterloo, a Master of Planning and Urban Development from Ryerson University, and a Bachelor of Arts in Global Development Studies and Italian from Queen's University. So thank you for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dr. Cooper, and thank you so much for having me today and for the warm welcome. I wish I could be there with you in person. I hear it's sunny today in Winnipeg. It is unfortunately quite dreary here in Toronto. And of course, we're all up in arms about the snow because Torontonians can't handle the winter. So as Dr. Cooper said, I'm Sam Biglieri, and I'm going to be talking to you today about aging, access, care, and inclusion in neighborhoods. Before I start off, I also want to acknowledge that I'm a settler. I'm a settler of Italian, Irish, Scottish, and French descent. And while we're meeting virtually, the land I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The land is covered by Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I also want to acknowledge that planning is a colonialist institution, and I believe it's my responsibility as a planning educator and researcher to work with Indigenous people towards reconciliation. Before I get started on the talk today, I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of where I come from as an academic, a scholar, a practitioner, and then sort of a personal bent as well, because I think that also really helps set the context for the talk. Dr. Cooper sort of covered it all already, but I'm a practicing planner. And my background was primarily in development consulting and working for public jobs for municipalities. So in terms of the academic perspective, I know that the places we live in and the problems associated with health and well-being impacts of neighborhoods, they're wicked problems. And so as a planner, I draw on a whole bunch of other disciplines, things like disability studies, environmental gerontology, urban studies, social citizenship, and dementia, the geographies of cognition, and even public health as well. And so I'm drawing on a whole bunch of other different disciplines and bringing it through into planning. And Sarah already mentioned this, so this is just an example of a couple of the kinds of work that I do, and those three different areas: older adults, people living with dementia, and looking at the governance of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so lastly, the personal. So I was really lucky. I got to spend a huge portion of my childhood with all four of my grandparents and my great-grandma, who sadly wasn't there for this classic 90s Florida photo. And it wasn't really until my nanny was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease that I began to realize how much of an impact the places we live in have on our quality of life. So you see, I grew up in a neighborhood called the Beaches in Toronto. It's in the East End. It's what our good friend Jane Jacobs might call the ideal fine-grained neighborhood where everything was accessible on foot. Public transit was just a step away. And if you had a car too, you know, your mobility was really quite unlimited. And I compare that to where my grandparents lived, and they, in the house my mom had grown up in, they lived at the end of a cul-de-sac in Oakville, which is just west of Toronto. It's what you might call a suburban municipality. And after my papa died, my nanny was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And we watched as this place in all of our memories, this magnificent place. They had a pool. We all hung out there, both sides of the family. We really watched it become like a prison for her. And it, you know, she lost the ability to drive. She was too scared to take the bus anymore, and she couldn't walk anywhere. And it really impacted her relationships with other people. It impacted her social health, her feelings of independence. And so just like we know someone with a wheelchair needs a ramp to get into a building instead of stairs, my mission is to really figure out what are those cognitive ramps for someone living with dementia to help them access the city just like everyone else. And so that's what's really guided my work moving forward. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about a couple of different interrelated things. When I talked to Dr. Cooper last year, we talked a little bit about bringing in these different aspects. And so I hope it's going to provide some food for thought for everyone. And so we're going to start off today talking a little bit about planning and justice. Going to move into a little study that just sort of wrapping up about how accessibility is conceptualized within the planning profession itself. Then I'm going to tell you about a different way of viewing everyday practices by using a care lens. And I'm going to end with talking about how this care lens came to be in my own research and how we might propose ways forward for us as a profession and as practitioners. So to start, I want to read you a quote by one of my favorite scholars, Dr. Amy Hemrahi, who is a critical disability studies scholar based in the US, and they write about accessibility and design. And so the quote is this: "The design of buildings and public spaces is not a value neutral and passive act. Rather, the design of the built environment actively conditions and shapes the assumptions that the designers, architects, and planners of these value-laden contexts hold with respect to who will and should inhabit the world. In short, built environments serve as litmus tests of broader social exclusions." And so just to let that sink in for a moment, and to note that more often than not, planners plan for people that look like them. And for me, sometimes that's not malicious, right? And it's really about a lack of understanding, awareness, and inclusion of different bodies in space and how we do our work. And it's really these social exclusions that get shown up in our built environments all the time, in the decisions we make about investments in our cities, everything. So the places we live in are a reflection of our society and what we deem valuable. And so that's why we have to be critical of everything we do and to know that systemic discrimination shows itself in the built environment. So this is a diagram I typically show like in first year of planning, because it also helps me to think about, you know, where can planners intervene? Because I also think that's important. Where can we intervene in our practice? So I think we can work towards justice in three ways. The first is through outcomes. So is a place physically accessible? Did we actually build attainable, affordable housing for people? The second way is through the process. So who gets access to the planning process, and is it done in a meaningful way? And then the third way is through practice. So how do we, as practitioners, how do we think about people who are different from us? And to investigate that third area, how we practice as planners, I recently ran a study with two fantastic grads of the planning program at York University, Salam Ayoub and Merve Kolchak. And part of this work was actually written up in the last issue of Plan Canada. So this is a piece of a puzzle. We're trying to understand, how do planners in our professional planning discourse how do we talk about disability and accessibility? So to do that, what we did is we took 3 magazines, and this is Ontario-centric, so I apologize in advance. But we took the national magazine, so that's Canadian Institute of Planners, Plan Canada, and then we took the magazine for Ontario. So before it was the Ontario Planning Journal, it's now called Y Magazine. We looked at all issues over the past 20 years, from 2000 to 2020. And so what did we find? Of the some 3,700 articles that were published over 20 years, only 96 mention disability or accessibility. That's 2.5% of all articles. And further to that, 17 out of 3,700 actually had disability as the main focus. Every other mention was talking about it in passing. So think of like a sentence, for instance, where it's listing, you know, we should pay attention to the needs of these multiply marginalized communities, as opposed to it being the central focus of the article. What else did we find? When did we find it? Most of the articles tended to correspond with changes in provincial planning policy, as well as accessibility legislation. The big piece of legislation came in 2005 in Ontario, so you can sort of see the spike there. But you can also see a spike related to the introduction of the World Health Organization's age-friendly cities concept. And then the province of Ontario subsequently giving out grants to do age-friendly planning. And we sort of see spikes there. And so this might also tell us that when we're talking about accessibility and disability, we're often talking about older adults. So I'll come back to that in a second. So in terms of the actual mentions, disability was mentioned 67 out of the 96 charted articles, and it was often used as an adjective or a descriptor. So for instance, it was often used in a list of marginalized groups that planners need to pay more attention to, as opposed to being the main topic, which I already talked about. And it was also frequently used as a synonym for something else instead of being engaged with directly. And it was discussed as things like a mobility impairment, a vision impairment, or as equal to vulnerability, or even as a consequence of older age. And I should note that few of these articles actually reported on research or even engagement with disabled folks themselves. When we look at accessibility, it was mentioned far more often. I only get thirsty when I'm talking, of course, right? So sorry. So it was mentioned far more often. Only about a quarter of the articles talked about it as a human rights issue, when we know access is a human rights issue. Many times they talked about it in terms of access to basic infrastructure, to specialized programming like paratransit. And they also talked about it as a form of checklist. So the accessibility checklist, did we build the ramp? Is the hallway wide enough, etc. And then perhaps really interesting there is that about 1/5 of the articles actually discussed access to the planning process itself. So most articles were about those planning outcomes as opposed to the process. A couple of the themes I wanted to highlight to you were the lines between aging populations and disabled populations, and they were often blurred together. It seemed like the majority of the time in these articles, disability and access were talked about in relation to older adults. So first off, while age is typically associated with acquired impairments, age is not a synonym for disability, nor is it a substitute for understanding the unique experiences of disabled folks. Now, bringing issues that older adults face and disabled folks face is not a bad thing, right? Because we need solidarity within movements, of course, but we also have to think about intersections of identity and disability and not lumping everybody together in one group. And that leads me to my next point. When intersectionality was discussed, it was usually just in that like list of typically forgotten groups versus actually engaging with how do these intersecting identities affect our experiences in space. And finally, disability was access was frequently talked about as a checklist again. And the truth is that access to public space is far more than just a built environment checklist. It's multifaceted, multi-scalar, and relational. So moving forward, some things we talked about in the article, you know, access is a human right, and it needs to be reflected in all of our planning policies. Right now, it's a little wishy-washy, to be absolutely honest, and it has to become a non-negotiable. We need to do that by centering the voices of disabled folks in our planning processes and outcomes. And this is really important. There was an article written in 2018 by Stafford and Baldwin, and they said they were looking at walkability studies and doing a review of walkability studies. And what they noticed and what they said was that failing to capture a diversity in ages and abilities has potentially resulted in data-informed practices and guidelines that perpetuate the exclusion of spatially marginalized groups. And so what they were concluding there is that a lot of the research is done with able-bodied folks. And so if it's about a big topic like walkability and we're not including disabled people, that data can be wrong, right? And so that's the risk that we are running here. And then also that issues in access are multi-scalar and interconnected, and they can be found in the built environment, housing, social programs and policies, public engagement, and beyond. And planners do have some control or like some say in how these things play out on the ground. And it really presents an opportunity for us to center accessibility. So how do we do this? And for this, I call on what my colleagues call an expanded definition of care. And what I'm going to explain to you here is the idea of combining an ethic of justice with care and thinking about how these two things coming together can help us think better about everyday life and then what to do as practitioners. So let's start off with justice. I'm sure most of you have heard about this. It comes from Susan Feinstein's book, The Just City, which was written in 2010. It's based off a number of different things, but primarily about the veil of ignorance, which John Rawls, who's a philosopher, talked about. This idea that, you know, you don't know what's beyond the veil if you were going to be born, but you don't know if you're going to be born as a woman, you don't know if you're going to be born as a person of color, but you would know that society you're going into is going to treat you well no matter what you look like. And so it's based on some of those philosophical ideas. It's a normative list of prescriptions. So it's a checklist, right? It's like, should do these things. It's a top-down sort of idea. And the three themes are equity, diversity, and democracy. And it's universal, right? It's about having that normative list. And I contrast that with a care ethic, a care response. And so this came from Jean Tronto in the 1980s. And part of that is to say, part of the quote is, care is everything people do to repair and maintain the world to live in it as well as possible. So care gives us an opportunity to do a number of things. It gives us an opportunity to focus on interdependence, the ability to balance structural issues like racism and ableism and sexism with a deep understanding of embodied agency. Just the focus on independence. It also gives us an opportunity to examine with everyday people and to understand their practices and what they do in response to injustice. And so it's a way of understanding what are people already doing? What does that tell us about how we should change the world? Because sometimes those normative prescriptions don't capture everything, right? And then it also relies on planners and researchers to work with communities to determine what justice is for them. And so these ideas come from a wonderful paper by Williams from 2017 in Antiquity. And they talk about how a care critique of the just city would get us to see all of humanity as vulnerable with a duty to care for others in public spaces. And as a society, we really have to challenge that notion of independence and focus on interdependence. And we all rely on humans more than human others, on built environments to live our everyday lives. And we need to start to recognize that. So now I'm going to show you how this expanded definition plays out in research that I did with people living with dementia, and how that work expanded how I thought about these things, and what that can teach us as planners beyond people living with dementia. So quick little context here. So dementia is an umbrella term. It's used to describe a set of symptoms. They can be things like memory loss, getting lost in familiar places, difficulty with language, feeling overwhelmed by noise and activity, putting things in the wrong place, issues or changes in behavior or personality. And they're caused by a variety of different diseases, the most common being Alzheimer's, but can also include vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal, etc. So mixed forms of dementia often coexist. And as a result, a lot of folks focusing on quality of life for people living with dementia tend to group folks in the same group. And that's what I've done here. I say PLWD for short and for time constraints. So to set some more context, the World Health Organization calls dementia the leading cause of dependency and disability among older adults worldwide, and 132 million people will be living with it by 2050. The majority of people assume that people living with dementia live in a care home, but that is not the case. Canadian estimates believe that 2/3 of those living with dementia actually live at home. In the UK, it's about 80%. And this is an issue because most research is done on the design of care homes versus public space, which is far harder to control, right? And much more contested because it's public and everyone lives there versus a controlled interior setting of a care home. And there are many benefits to being able to access one's neighborhood, a sense of dignity, improved mental and physical health, a number of reasons why people living with dementia deserve to access the neighborhood just like anyone else. So what we do know from existing research, and it's growing every day, but we know in terms of distance and how we get around a neighborhood, that matters. So research that was done in Israel found that when they tracked people with mild dementia versus older adults without dementia, those with mild dementia traveled on average 400 meters from their home, and older adults 1.5 kilometers, a mile to a quarter mile, basically. And that's what this looks like when you represent it on a map in suburban Waterloo, which is where I did the research. And so you can see like the difference between an as the crow flies distance versus like actual distance because of the loopy-loop roads we've got going on there. And it's this concept of the shrinking world, the idea that as you get older, you may experience some form of impairment and your life space gets smaller. And that's what makes it integral for planners to understand how to make neighborhoods more supportive to someone with dementia. So the research was done in suburban Waterloo region. So everybody lived in a typologically defined suburb. This is from Dave Gordon at Queen's Classic Canadian Suburbs Research. I'm sure you've probably seen this. And so just to show you, everybody lived in a suburb. I worked with 7 different individuals. They were all community dwelling. They had all been diagnosed and they're all part of a support group. Now this wasn't just like one interview. This was like 20 plus hours with people. And it involved everything from a sit down interview, go along interviews, taking photos, GPS tracking, travel diaries, going to planning public meetings, a whole bunch of things. So lots of time spent with folks. And that was really important because working with people living with dementia, you know, you've met one person with dementia, you've met one person with dementia, and getting to actually know somebody and being able to communicate with them in a way that works for them, being able to build rapport and gain trust is also incredibly important. So in doing this work, and in terms of selecting methods, I wanted to center the experiences of people living with dementia. And that's where I turned to DAI, Dementia Alliance International. And they talk about how they want a world where a person with dementia continues to feel fully valued and included, nothing about us without us. And you'll notice that's borrowed from the disability rights movement. And that's why for this work, I focused only on their perspectives, not on the perspectives of care partners, not on the perspectives of doctors. And while those are important perspectives, of course, I really wanted to center that the person with dementia's voice, because often they're left out of research. So did all of this work. and then started to come across this idea of care. And this is the full quote from Toronto and Fisher that I previously read to you. But basically, she continues to say, the world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. And I found that this care lens was a really interesting way to view this data of people living with dementia and sort of expand these ideas. So in using care as an analytical lens, it allows us to get away from this one-way question where it's like, who cares for whom? Person with dementia, care partner, cares for person with dementia, to thinking about it as much more like, much bigger than that how do we care? And that gets us to think about interdependencies, examine structure, agency, embodiment, and it allows us to research the ordinary, what's visible but escapes our attention, and show how it matters. And so for people living with dementia, their ordinary was changing every day. And they were beginning to notice frictions between the changes in their everyday lives and the world around them. And the folks told me they had good and bad days, but it's important to note that dementia is progressive. And many of them reflected on the impact their symptoms had on them. So with the most common and prominent change being that they lost their driver's license and their shrinking life space in their car-dependent neighborhoods. And they expressed a newfound fear of getting lost in unfamiliar places. Others noticed impaired depth perception, impaired risk analysis, and having to be on alert at all times, which didn't happen previously. And others described feeling panicky and losing confidence in oneself and finding walking around to be almost prohibitive. And so this is a quote from Elizabeth, and we were crossing the street at a residential intersection. So there were like no cars, but this is something that she said to me. I feel a bit nervous because I just worry. I just kind of feel a bit panicky. That's a new thing too, is panic. I get panicky and freaked out. So when I was doing this work, we came up with a couple of different themes for understanding this work. So the first theme was self-care in place over time. And so examining life courses in a discipline like geography is not new at all, because we know that someone's history really influences what they do currently. And so I'll read you one quick vignette to illustrate this. So Alexander, he lives in the same town he grew up in, approximately 250 meters from his childhood home. He moved back to that location from a different suburban area in the same region because of the sense of familiarity and the prospect of accessing things on foot after losing his license. Alexander had grown up driving everywhere and had to teach himself how to use the bus. After a career in manufacturing jobs, Alexander says it's part of the reason he likes walking in industrial areas, because it makes him feel like he has a purpose. So a common thread, and I'd love to read you all of the other stories, but a common thread throughout each of these stories was how familiarity was such a great sense of comfort. And this familiarity could be because of living in one place for a long amount of time. It could be because you lived in a similar but geographically different place, or they've experienced their home location by visiting it as a young person. And for me, I think we can think of these vignettes as almost like the past self taking care of the present day self by producing that familiarity through time. In terms of present day self-care, people living with dementia engage in a number of practices that I call self-care. It's basically that in their everyday, they altered their behavior based on the built environment in order to ensure they don't get stressed out or panicked while they're walking. So let me show you a couple examples. So one aspect was avoiding what we like to call arterial roads. So these are 4 to 6 lane roads, often 60 kilometers an hour, big box stores on either side. And these roads were roads that people with dementia did not like traveling on and would purposefully either avoid them altogether or treat them as an imaginary boundary that they just do not cross. So they avoided those streets while purposefully using others So they actively sought out residential streets, which was one way to ensure self-care, that they felt safe, comfortable, and familiar. And these streets were often narrow, had buffer zones with trees between roads and sidewalks to ensure that safe feeling. One of the most interesting instances of self-care was a way to avoid sensory overload. And this was through the use of medians. And this is probably one of the most interesting parts about this study. So the picture on the left there that's got grass and the bigger highway. So we're walking down what seems like a little bit of a gravel path there. And I turned to the participant, he's like, we're gonna cross here. And you can see in the foreground there is an all-way intersection a little bit farther up. And I said, oh, well, why are we crossing at the intersection? And he said, we're just going to cross in the median. And so I asked him after we crossed the road, and he said, you know, I cross at the median because I don't like the four-way intersection. And the reason is that there's so much going on there. There's red lights, green lights, yellow lights. There's the little person counting down and blinking. You have to make sure you stay within the lines. You have to watch for the cars turning left and the cars turning right. And maybe somebody didn't slow down. And he said it was too much. And so instead, he likes crossing at the median because he only has to pay attention to one input of information at a time. The car's coming at you in one direction. And then you can wait, take a deep breath, and then keep going. And so for him and for a couple of other participants, they did the same thing. It was a way of slowing down the world so that they could get across the street, a form of self-care. Another way folks were caring for themselves in space was in noting different kinds of landmarks to help them along familiar routes. So these landmarks can be thought of in their psychological typologies. And this comes from work from O'Malley et al. In 2018 in the UK. And they talk about the psychological typologies of landmarks for people living with dementia. So I want you to take a moment and indulge me for a second. You can close your eyes if you like. If not, just think about it for a moment. So you're at home. We've all been working from home for a while. Think about the place you call home. Is it an apartment, a house? Is it a room? Where is it? What neighborhood are you in? Now, think about your workplace, the one that maybe we will all go back to soon, or school. Think about that place. Where is it? What neighborhood is it in? Now I want you to think about your favorite grocery store and where that is. And I want you to think about some of your favorite spots to spend time. Maybe it's a park, library, a gym, institution. And think about the other important destinations that you go to on a daily, weekly basis. Okay, you can open your eyes again. So these kinds of places are what the psychologists would call anchors of your cognitive map. And they're places that tend to guide your everyday system of navigation. They are also places that you probably have some kind of a social connection to, like work, like school, like that favorite grocery store. And that's why they're important. Now, if you go back to thinking about your house and your workplace, if you imagine your trip from home to work, pay attention to things like, just think about it right now. You know, you walk at the end of the street, you turn right, and you know that's where the bus stop is. So you wait for the bus to come, and then you wait for them to call Bond Street, which is where my office is. And then you get off the bus, and then I turn left on Bond Street, and my office is the building with the big blue sign outside of it. So just thinking about what are those things in your environment that cue you to do certain things: turn left, turn right, keep going. And these are what we like to call beacons. So they're like little beacons telling you you're on the right way, or it's a directional cue to tell you, okay, you have to turn right or left. So the moral of this whole exercise here is that navigating from one place to another can be a highly involved cognitive process. And it involves our short-term memory, it involves our long-term memory, and neuroscientists tell us that navigating in a familiar versus an unfamiliar environment can involve different cognitive processes. So we're talking about familiar right now. And I want to show you a couple of the landmarks that people with dementia pointed out. So many participants talked about using destinations as landmarks. And these were their anchors of their cognitive maps. They were prominent in people's minds. They had some kind of social connection. So there's the Tim Hortons, where one gentleman goes like every week to get to see the lovely people there. And that plays a big role for him. Another gentleman loved the home hardware because he'd go and continue to work on projects while their wife was at work. And then the Kitchener Public Library, lots of programs and a place to meet people and to like be out in public. People also use landmarks as directions, so those directional cues. So this church, this bungalow, they didn't really have any social connection to these places, but they were okay, I'm going to turn right now. Okay, I'm going to turn left now, keep going. And so that's another way they saw landmarks. Another way that I thought was really interesting as a way to use landmarks as either directions or beacons was looking for certain front yards and homes. So in a suburban environment of sameness, people were looking for difference in order to be able to orient themselves. So we had the house with the red RV, that was the cue to turn right. The house with the little library that they always opened when they went on a walk to see if they could exchange a book. And then the third photo there is a gentleman who said, I know I'm going the right way because that's where there's an elderly couple. They sit on their porch all the time and I like to wave to them. And the issue with these is that these kinds of landmarks can be temporary. And so if the red RV suddenly goes on a trip, what happens then, right? And finally, people were using landmarks as compasses. So I'm born and raised in Toronto. You can see the CN Tower behind me. The CN Tower is always south. The lake is always south. And so that's one way that I'm like, I know where I am. In Kitchener-Waterloo, my goodness, is it confusing because you don't know which way is up. But for people living with dementia, they were making these landmarks as compasses all the time. So one example is the image here with the river. That's the Grand River. And so one gentleman said, it's on my left when I'm going downtown. It's on my right when I come home. Another gentleman talked about Walmart as being like a compass because you can see Walmart, the sign, from really far away. And so maybe not encouraging big box stores by any stretch of the imagination, but it is something that's prominent in the landscape. And finally, another example here is it's not a church tower, it's City Hall, but it has chimes on the hour, basically tell you what time it is. And so one participant used that as a soundscape landmark. And they knew that if they wanted to head downtown, they had to head towards the sound in order to get there. So still thinking about present day self-care, another way that everyday practices were affected was in how doctors told participants to act in public space. So this ranged from Joe's doctor who said, he prescribed 3 social activities a week and 3 physical activities a week, including walking outside, versus Elizabeth, whose doctor, upon her diagnosis, told her that she should never go outside again by herself. And so this severely impacted her everyday practices, of course. And her experience specifically can tell us how the societal stigma of dementia is enacted vis-a-vis medical professionals, which I think is really problematic as well. When we think about planning for care in the future, participants did a number of really interesting things to care for their future selves. So the first, and one of my favorites, was Douglas, who trained his dogs how to walk around the block, in the same block every single day, in the hopes that one day, if he ever got disoriented, the dogs would know that they had to just keep walking home. Another person, Joe, he talked about keeping the cobwebs off his internal mental map. And he did that by constantly walking, because he said if he missed a couple of days, he felt like he might lose that information. And all participants taught themselves, and I say taught in quotation marks, but I mean taught because they were all driving before. So they all started to walk more and were like, what can I get to on foot? And also teaching themselves how to take transit because they had a car and they never had to take transit. So they're teaching themselves how to do that. The second theme here is care interdependence in place. And so people living with dementia are often framed as dependent, but when we look and we use this care lens, we can actually find out that they were caring for others in a variety of different ways. So that's, buying neighbors groceries for them. It was shoveling snow for older neighbors, a general sense of looking out for one another, running errands for their partners while their partners were at work. Douglas, he cared for his partner by not veering off his daily walking route so that his partner would always know where he was. And Alexander, he promised his sister that he'd always wear like the reflective gear so that he'd be more visible to cars while walking. And people with dementia also created and relied on these complex mobility networks made up of walking, transit, car rides. And so I just want to show you what that looks like on a map. So this is one participant. When they were walking by themselves, they traveled probably like 2.5 kilometers from home. And if we only looked at that as researchers, we'd say, that's quite small, right? But when you look at where he went when he was relying on this complex interdependent mobility web, he actually went to a lot more places, right? And so if we only focus on independent mobility, we're missing this other story about participation in public life. And the last piece I've got here is documenting encounters with human and more than human others can make people living with dementia feel cared for in public space and in their neighborhoods. And so during our go-along interviews, every single participant said hello to at least one passerby that they did not know. So there was George commenting on the nice weather, Lorraine cooing at a baby in a stroller, or even Alexander chatting up a stranger about last night's football game. And after it happened, they all seemed to have more pep in their step. And it really suggested those kinds of encounters make people feel good. And so that's sort of what was happening in these two photos I actually just showed you, right? Waving to a couple that you know is always there, and then the more than human interacting with that library. So let's come back to the care lens idea. And I created this diagram to help us as practitioners, researchers, activists, to think through how a person is involved in a complex web of caring, really inspired by that work I just presented to you. And so I think a care lens allows us to examine these everyday socio-spatial relations and practices as acts of care. And the work that I just showed you shows that the unpredictability of dementia actually makes it really difficult to maintain one's world so that they can live in it as best as possible. But the folks I worked with are really doing their best in the suburban areas that they live in by literally remaking their spaces and using new practices to fit those changing needs and abilities. And we really have to think about not only changing discourse about how to make people with dementia feel included in society, but to really support that inclusion in public space. So care overall, it gets us to see our lives as interdependent, see those caring relations at all scales, and it can be applicable to a number of different areas. And I think by asking these multi-scalar questions, we can start to think through complexity. Been thinking about this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic as well. I'm so happy to talk about that too. So how can a care lens help practitioners beyond dementia? So I think that it can help in a couple of ways. So one, it can help us identify inaccessible built environments, shown by a number of the poor urban design choices we just looked at. It can also help us notice innovative practices. It's not all bad, right? Like people are creative in how they do things. And so planners, it's not just about what the problems are, but what are you doing that I can help build on? Do I build more medians in the middle of roads? Maybe, right? We can discover how people create those interdependent care networks. Again, going away from travel only as home to work. Travel is much more multifaceted than that. And that builds off like feminist theories of transportation and geography as well. to understand the power of small encounters, those little encounters with your neighbors, the little hi, does make you feel better, right? And then it also allows us to investigate how spatial practices are affected by broader sociocultural political structures like racism, ableism, and stigma against dementia. In order to understand these relations, and this is something that disabled folks have been doing forever, hacking ways in order to make their lives easier for them. And the reason why they've had to do that is because we live in a world that was built for the normate body. And so the normate is a phrase that Garland Thompson came up with, and it describes the white, heterosexual, upper middle class man who is able-bodied. And the thing is that the cities and systems we live in are mostly made for that normate, and we tend to institutionalize bodies that don't fit. But I think by listening to and really engaging with older adults, disabled folks, as well as other equity-seeking groups in diverse ways, and you can use, interesting ways to get at that. Those are some examples up there. I really think that we can challenge this. And this idea follows in the footsteps of great scholars who have long talked about these multiple sociospatial relationalities that exist between our bodies, others, more than human others, built environments, communities, these structures. And I call on us to continue to think of care as multi-directional instead of that linear way, and to really see people as interdependent and push back against this idea of independence. It's a falsehood, and it's not helping us, I think. And I think I know this is a call that's been put forward by disabled activists and scholars for decades. Now, I'm going to end off with a little bit of research that's ongoing, but I think telling stories has been important always, but even now more than ever in the pandemic. These are a couple photos taken by a participant in my study, a photo voice study about dementia and living with dementia and COVID-19 in Oshawa, which is just east of Toronto. And these are two photos that John, not his real name, he took. And at first glance, you're like, what are these a photo of? But he explained to me that he goes to Canadian Tire, he takes the bus to Canadian Tire whenever he feels lonely and wants to talk to somebody, because it's a place where everybody knows what his name is. And he stops to chat and he knows everyone. He knows who has children and who's having issues, and he's there to talk to them. And then the waterfront that he took a picture of is the place that he likes to go early in the morning when it's quiet, see the natural landscape, and to feel known, because all the dog walkers also know his name. And it's a way for him to feel included. And there's all kinds of caring relations going on in this photo, right? People, pets, nature, built environments, public transport system. And I'll finish off by saying that bodies are fluid, messy, and constantly changing. And I think that noticing innovative practices and tactics through this lens of care can help us reveal structural inequities. Care balances agency, structural issues, embodiment, life course understandings. And we really do need to get us all to think of humanity, all of us, as vulnerable, with a duty to care for others in public space and challenge that discourse of independence. And I really think that using care can also help us build towards collective care in public space and better supporting each other, and to go beyond disciplinary boundaries. So I will end there. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Sam. I really appreciate the presentation and the ideas of care and interdependence, and using this lens of care as a way of developing, or not even developing policy, I was gonna say developing policy, but even before that, of thinking about what's already happening, what are the best ways that we can support people, all of that kind of stuff. And you had some really specific applications for planners, but I think that, as you said, like accessibility being a human right means that there's so many different layers to it, right? It's not just the built environment, it's all the different aspects that create a city and the networks of people who live in it and all of that. So we have a few minutes minutes for questions. If you would like, I think because we are short on time, maybe if you have a question, if you'd like to put it in the chat, I can read it out. And we have a comment from Trish to get us started. So Trish said, the care lens use brings home the reason why taking people out of their familiar environment, like a community or neighborhood, causes distress and likely stimulates the I want to go home when relocated to a foreign environment. It also makes me think that the walking, talking GPS maps, like on iPhones or other devices, could be programmed with home and store, park, restaurants, etc., so that the person can press home to get directions and then be able to go farther.
Yeah, great comment. And I remember talking to someone who wasn't in the study, but is someone living with dementia, and they were like really taking advantage of their phone in that respect. And while they used GPS, they found while walking, it was like a little confusing. So instead of saying like homework, what they would do is as they went out for a walk, they'd like take photos as they were walking, so that they could go back and look through them in case they were confused. So there's like other ways that people are using it too. Another gentleman in this study talked about taking photos of people now, and then also having in his contacts like photos of them 10 years ago or when they were a kid, and then having all their social media profiles in the contact as well, and like last messages, so that when he talked to them, he could like review and then talk to them after. Or loving the use of emojis, because sometimes you couldn't remember the word, but like emojis, you can just like flip through until you find the right feeling or thing. So yeah, a great comment.
Sarah, did you have a question?
I was trying to type it up, so that's why I put my hand up at the same time to see what would be faster. But thank you for letting me speak. Thank you, Sam, for speaking today. It's really exciting to see you speak again. I just really wanted to ask a quick question about, you were talking about like moving beyond just using checklists for increasing accessibility. And in my research, I'm sort of finding that a lot of people want, planners in particular, to make change in accessibility want legislation or checklists or guidelines. And so I'm sort of curious how we shift that, like until we see those societal shifts that just then reflect themselves in built environments, like how you suggest that this can be better reflected in planning and design, while also sort of countering this idea of like, you know, we want to include disabled voices, but not sort of requiring the emotional labor of these voices, like to do anything. I'm curious sort of where you think that middle ground is going to be reached in planning, and sort of until things shift in that direction.
Oh, such a good question, Sarah. And I don't know the answer. I think, you know, like having checklists it's like a bare minimum, right? To force people to do things, and sometimes they don't even listen to the checklist, right? And so, you know, when I think like it's also about like incrementalism. I think incrementalism, you know, is realistic. But at the same time, I think we have to do it sort of on all these fronts, right? Like, can we change the checklist? Can we get it enshrined into policy, get it in, and then have that as like a segue to talking about the complexity? And, you know, I think this also goes to like colleagues who think about organizational behavior, right? And like, how do we change the behavior of planners? I think it's multifaceted. It's through continuous professional learning. It's through the education we get as planners, through like the culture in a municipality. I've also heard, you know, if you have a really good accessibility coordinator who's super involved, people are more likely to think about it. And so like the roles of different leaders within an organization as well, I think makes a huge difference. But you've really hit the nail on the head, right? Like planners want checklists, architects want checklists so that they know they did it. But yeah, we have to broaden this idea. I kind of see it as like this, the checklist is like the in, and then we can have this bigger discussion. But yeah, I think it has to be on multiple fronts for sure. A non-answer.
Oh, thanks. So we probably have time for one more question. Does anybody want to jump in here? I have one question, Sam, about the research. I was interested in the, in one of your slides, you had the 7 participants, and you mentioned their ages, and I noticed that about half of them were sort of under 65, and I was wondering if those people had a different experience than older people with dementia because their peer group would be different. And so then if they experience the city in different ways, like, if their peers are, like, for example, still working and they're not able to work anymore, or, I don't know what else it might be, but I was just curious about that.
Yeah. It's because I recruited from actually an early onset, primarily an early onset support group. What I can say is that I think the stigma is felt like even more, especially for the younger folks, especially like you said, because their peers are still working. And I had someone, I sat down with them and they said, I got diagnosed and my friends think I'm contagious and they don't visit me anymore. And then she broke down crying. I started to cry, I think that's felt a lot. And then also, desire to seek purpose as well. And so, if your partner's working, especially for the men in my study, I noticed a lot of them focus on doing home projects. So they like going to home hardware and stuff and helping out around the house, because I have this feeling they felt like this was the one way they could contribute. And I will say, in terms of like mobility, older adults, they are more likely to experience like a mobility impairment. And the younger people in my study, one person used a mobility device, but they all still walked outside. And differences in like distance and stuff. I want to say it did matter in age, but it almost didn't. Like the 82-year-old still took me on like a 2-kilometer walk. And then another person took me on a 1-kilometer walk and they were in their 50s. So yeah, it's, I think more like I'm doing more work now. I'm doing more work with actually immigrants living with dementia, especially because of this idea of familiarity. So everyone in my study was white, had grown up in a suburb, had grown up in Waterloo mostly. And so when they talk about familiarity, the question becomes like, if you immigrated, if you came from, like my grandparents came from a tiny little village in Italy and then came to Canada, what kind of change would that have on your sense of familiarity too? So yeah, more research needs to be done for sure.
Great, thank you so much. Well, it's just after 1, so please join me in thanking Dr. Biglieri for her presentation today. Excellent. And yeah, thanks so much. And we will see you again at another Food for Thought sometime soon, hopefully.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. If you want to get in touch, maybe you can send it on my email, or if you just put my name. It's mine, samantha.biglieri@ryerson.ca. If you're interested to talk more. Thanks so much.
Thanks all.
All right.